Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Zelda Retrospective. I was going to make this one a long video initially, but it was taking far too long, so I'm just going to save awkward enough time for the next video. This is part 2 of my coverage, so if you missed the first part, be sure to check it out where I talk about Zelda 1, 2 and Link to the Past. Before we get into the bulk of today's content, I want to mention a few other games that I couldn't really fit in anywhere else. The Game & Watch line is a series of handhelds released from the 80s to the 90s using liquid crystal displays that represent objects in the game, hence the term LCD. Zelda had its own Game & Watch game in 1989, and unfortunately there isn't much around about this thing, and physical copies can be rather expensive. But Zelda had another one of his LCD games called the Zelda Game Watch. Get rid of the "and", it makes it more special. And with this, I have even less to talk about. There's just nothing to it. You push 3 buttons and things light up. How anyone can enjoy this is beyond me. Up next, the Satellaview titles. Satellaview was a Japan-only service for the Super Famicom, where on certain days of the week and at certain times, different games would be available to play. And twice, Zelda got this treatment. The first being a 16-bit remake of the original, which I'm pretty sure is the exact same game, with better graphics and sound design. The second was called Ancient Stone Tablets, a sort of remixed version of Link to the Past, with new dungeon layouts, items, and uses the avatars of Satellaview rather than Link as a protagonist. Out of all these games though, not a single one of them has been released outside this in any capacity. I'm sure you can find ROMs for them online, but in terms of official content, not a thing. But with that out the way, we can now get into the real meat of the video. In 1989, Nintendo had their flag firmly on the handheld market with the Game Boy, making that its primary console, taking over from the previously mentioned Game Watch line. Despite its display being in monochrome, having no backlight and needing a torch to see what you're doing most of the time, the Game Boy is one of the most successful handhelds ever released, and it's not a surprise that Zelda had an input on that. It wasn't until 1993 that Link's Awakening was released, and along with its enhanced sibling, Link's Awakening DX, sold close to 6 million copies when the Game Boy line finally died in 2003. Link's Awakening is a result you get from a demake of the SNES game, with deviations from Link to the Past to accommodate the handheld system. Before I get started, I'll be covering Link's Awakening DX, released for the Game Boy Color in 1998. These two versions are exactly the same, except DX has an extra dungeon and colour. From the start, we see Link caught in a thunderstorm and to be found lying on the beach before bringing us to the title screen. This Link is the same guy that we played as in Link to the Past, where the NES games have a completely different Link set right into the timeline. After naming ourselves accordingly, we wake up in a bed with no recollection of where we are or how to leave. The girl next to you is Marin, probably the only NPC worth giving a shit about, as she is quite important to the game's story. Anyway, we are told our sword is still back on the beach, but Marin's father managed to keep our shield safe, so take it, head left, and get a heart piece before finally claiming our sword. You can get a heart piece in this game before you even have the chance of taking any damage. Let this be a sign. But now that we have our sword, an owl by the name of Kapora Gabora swoops in and informs us that in order to leave the island, we must wake the windfish by gathering the 8 instruments and playing them for an egg on top of Mount Camaranch. Setting ourselves for another adventure across Koholint Island, Link heads back to May Village and the mysterious forest to find the key to the first dungeon, Tail Cave. After clearing this place, back in Maid Village, a resident's pet has been kidnapped and Link used the trapped animal, once freeing him, to enter the second dungeon. Beating that dungeon gives Link access to most of the rest of the map, including 4 of the 6 remaining dungeons. It's also around this time that you start learning songs on your ocarina. The first and most important song is the Ballad of the Windfish. After clearing each dungeon, the owl gives Link hints on the location of the next dungeon, and when each boss dies, they give some vague warnings on what will happen if the Windfish wakes up, implying the entire island and everything on it would disappear. Link collects the remaining magic instruments, and once all are acquired, only the challenge of waking the egg and leaving remain. By now, you should really understand what would happen if the Windfish ever wakes up. All the inhabitants of Koholint Island will vanish without a trace. Although the entire game is hinted at being a dream, I can't help but feel like it's something a bit more sinister. Climbing up the steps of the mountain, Link plays the Ballad of the Windfish one more time, and instruments begin to play themselves, cracking open the egg for Link to head inside, navigate through a small puzzle, and defeating the last nightmare lying within. With that finally done, the windfish wakes up and the island vanishes, leaving an elf boy sat on a raft in the middle of the ocean with a windfish flying overhead. Kinda bleak really. A simple story for a rather simple game. No Ganon, no Zelda, the Triforce is absent, and even the Master Sword doesn't appear. Nothing from this game's story is really all that memorable or relevant to the wider series. In fact, the only thing that is memorable is the character Marin I mentioned earlier. She plays songs when you speak to her, can talk to animals, and is the only character dreaming of something more outside the island. No other character in the series has had any sort of real development like this, so it makes her interesting. What's also interesting is that she likes to abuse chickens, dig up dirt, insult your music, and get kicked out of the crane minigame. If it's story you're after, then I'd recommend reading this game's manga, something pretty much every main Zelda title has. The gameplay here is very similar to Link to the Past and the original, a top-down adventure, and I'm glad to say that this is a style every other handheld Zelda game would take from this point on. Less buttons and far less power than SNES, this bite-sized Zelda game feels like what the original Zelda should have been. You can use A and B for any items you want, pause the game to switch out all items, including the sword, something you typically always have to have equipped, but movement is done with the D-pad and select opens the map, which initially looks like shit, but the more you explore, the more you unlock, which I think is the best way of doing it. Movement is a little slow for my liking, but not enough to have a massive impact on the game. I just wish Link walked a lot faster. New items like Rock's Feather give Link the ability to jump and cross gaps, as well as some platforming inside some dungeons, and you can use returning items in the exact same way as an SNES game, like the bow and hookshot, except for the flute. Rather than being used for fast travel, this just plays 3 songs near various points in the game, and fast travel itself has been completely removed, except for 3 warp points that you rarely need to use, which sucks, as walking across Cold Island takes forever with each momentary pause after moving screens. And what's worse is that this map isn't nearly as easy to recollect as Hyrule in Link to the Past. I can name a few things, but past that point I'm back to blowing up skulls to open the way to a ruined castle with no signpost. It's not as bad as the original, but could have been much better. Dungeons fluctuate in length and not so much difficulty, with the first 2 being incredibly easy and linear. After that point, you can enter the bonus dungeon in the DX version that uses the power of code to give you new armour that either doubles your defence, like Link to the Past, or double your strength, making it twice as hard, and by proxy, making the game even fucking easier. Instead of getting harder further on, dungeons just get a lot more non-linear, especially in Dungeon 7 and 8. Dungeon 7, Eagle Tower, has you lug this metal ball through the entire dungeon to destroy pillars to reach the boss. But every time it falls down a hole, or when you fall down a hole, or even when you go through certain doors, its position is reset. You have to carry it back through rooms you've already cleared to knock down one pillar. And Turtle Rock, the 8th dungeon, is a massive labyrinth with so many rooms you revisit again and again, making it the longest dungeon I've played so far. Bosses have also taken a major hit from the last game, with not a single one of them being a real challenge. These guys are all pushovers, especially with both level 2 sword and the red tunic, dealing 4 times damage you would normally. But not even that can match the power of the boomerang. Simply by trading a shovel to a crocodile hiding inside a cave, you can break this game in 2. This isn't a boomerang, it's a fucking cannon. It deals 12 times your normal damage, has no armor like the bow, and kills the fire boss in 1 hit. It's ridiculous. Obtaining some items has also deviated slightly. Lens of Truth comes from a really long fetch quest involving the crane minigame, a Yoshi doll, and mermaid scales, but most come from inside dungeons or by buying them from the shop in Maid Village. The shovel, bombs, and bow all come from here, but the bow costs nearly 1,000 rupees to claim. You can steal from the shop, but that results in your farm name being changed to Thief. And should you walk back into the shop, it's an instant game over. Potion bottles have also vanished, but it's not like you'll need them for how easy the main game is. Heart pieces, however, do return, but there's only 12, not 20, with the cap for heart containers being 14. The issue with most is that you'll see that piece in the overworld and have no idea how to get it, only to come back to it 4 hours later with the item you need. All the hidden secrets, 10 Voodoo Rupees, or the boomerang I mentioned before. exploring isn't really a focus here. This game's music is also really hit or miss for me. The chiptune 8-bit peppiness of the overworld theme is nice to listen to, and the sound effects when killing an enemy is satisfying enough, while the dungeon theme gets repetitive fast, but the best track in the game is easily the title theme. It's probably my favourite in the series. This game has a bunch of other charming little notes about it, which I find oddly endearing. Mario enemies like Shy Guys, Goombas and Piranha Plants appear in the platforming, Kirby is an enemy in some areas, and the residents keep chain chomps as pets, which can be used to devour plants, sharks and moblins whole. I really do enjoy this game. Yeah, it's fairly easy, but it's good for a small power trip in short bursts. From the outside, it's one of the most upbeat games in the series, playing off the very little sense of danger to make it stand out as a Zelda game any player can get into. It feels like a pocket version of what the Super Nintendo game was, and it's very easy to pick up, play for an hour and come back to. Unfortunately, it doesn't last for more than 8 hours, which after Link to the Past is somewhat short, as that game was around 14 hours long, and with later games having so much more content. It is definitely a good thing this was a handheld game. It fits the Game Boy and handheld scene like gloves fit a hand. If you liked Link to the Past, this game is simply more of it, just not too much more. Now putting it on a home console changes some things. The Switch remake of Link's Awakening is, believe it or not, the first true remake of a Zelda game from the ground up. Prior to this, Nintendo would just take the previous game, give it a bit of polish, and smack a new logo and price tag onto it. But for Link's Awakening, they couldn't really do that. How do you polish this? So they got a new team together and said, fuck it, it's a toy now. Released only a couple of years ago, Link's Awakening S, which is how I refer to this game to not cause confusion, uses a really nice art style that makes everything look like glossy dioramas, along with balancing the game so now you can die more easily. They also added some more warp points, along with potion bottles and more item slots, and an absolute fuck ton more heart pieces. This is as faithful a remake it could be, while also improving on the original. Just look at the new animated sequence for this game. Although I do think the music isn't as good, especially the title track, but honestly, nothing can match that. They also added a dungeon creator tool, which is neat, but isn't expanded enough to feel worth doing. I also disagree in charging full price for this game. Underneath the fancy new look and improvements, at its core, it's just a Game Boy game, and as such, it'll be finished in under 12 hours, and most of the added time comes from just the new heart pieces. All in all, I consider that S is the best way to experience this game, and for people that didn't play the original, leaves them with very little reason to go back and play it. But for me though, I have much fond attachment to DX. The first 3 Zelda games I played were the original 1986 game, Link Between Worlds, and Link's Awakening on the 3DS. First one confused me, and Link Between Worlds I'll get to much later, but Link's Awakening made me a fan of the series as a whole. You didn't need to know anything about the series beforehand, and made for a great gateway into one of my favourite franchises. I'm not sure that S can really do that with Breath of the Wild and soon Skyward Sword hogging the space. I can't see myself ever really replaying S, while I feel I can always go back to the Game Boy. And seeing as I touched upon it a little before, let's discuss ports, shall we? Unlike the previous video, where I had a lot to discuss, here there's very little. You can play the original 1993 version on any Game Boy console except the Micro, and the same with the DX copy from 1998. Just bear in mind, if you play the DX version or an original Game Boy, it will work, but you can't get to the core dungeon. The DX version was released on the 3DS Virtual Console in 2011, but its older sibling is absent. If you want to play the Pensioner, you'll need the original cartridge and a compatible device. And finally, we have the remake from 2019 by Grezzo. Yeah, they couldn't be fucked to do it themselves, so they got people that made Street Pass Garden to do it instead. Well, with that out the way, you can move on to what is unquestionably one of the greatest games of all time. Forgetting Link's Awakening for a moment, no other Zelda title was released for 7 years after Link to the Past. Both Sega and Sony had already made the leap to the 3D console by 1994, leaving Nintendo behind until 1996, and the Virtual Boy certainly didn't help them. Jumping from 2D to 3D, next time we can discuss Ocarina of Time. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.